And the conflict diamonds are so-called alluvial diamonds. They come, from streams. Okay. De Beers obviously wants to limit the amount of diamond supply. That's its whole business model, right? And so De Beers is very happy to discourage conflict diamonds, because De Beers doesn't have to worry about that, because De Beers all has deep mine diamonds. They're all legal diamonds. Okay, fine. Be that as it may. Okay, so we've made a lot of progress. Okay, so if you ask yourself, are there fewer conflict diamonds being sold now? Yeah. Okay. Why are there fewer conflict diamonds being sold? Well, the CSR story would be, well, we have these certification, we have these standards, the big retailers like Tiffany's, etc., are very sensitive to their public image. They're making sure that these diamonds, which they buy, don't get a consumer boycott. They get worried about the movie, but their nightmare would be, I'm about to get engaged and I buy my betrothed, woman I'm in love with. I save up all my money for several years and I buy this beautiful diamond and hand to her and get on my knees to express my love. And she turns to me and says, "Oh, but can you assure me that this was not a conflict diamond?" Okay. I don't think it's ever going to happen or would happen, but that's the diamond industry's nightmare, right? Take it away. No, sorry, you can't assure me that it's not a conflict-free diamond. I don't want it. Okay, so unlikely, but that's the industry's nightmare. Okay. Okay. So we've made a lot of progress. However, the real reason why there are fewer conflict diamonds because there's fewer conflict. Right? There's less civil wars in African countries, and there's more stable governments, and of course, therefore, the opportunities to harvest illegal diamonds have diminished. So again, is this about corporate responsibility, or is it about changes in state policy in Africa? And so, at the end of the day, I suspect, if you have strong, effective governments, responsible governments in countries, not simply Africa, but as well, you have responsible, effective governments in countries which have alluvial diamonds, and they don't have civil wars, and they control them. You don't need the Kimberley Accord. It's going to work, right? So I think in all these areas, it's always important to look at, what's the role of the state and what's the role of the firms. And finally, the final one I want to make is that, a lot also depends on from a business point of view. In some cases, consumers are willing to pay a premium for responsibly produced products, and of course, then the market works. But in most cases, they're not. And so in most cases, basically, unless we can produce them more efficiently and greener, and unless we can get governments to enforce these standards, the amount of progress we're going to make is going to remain a challenge. So basically, that's sort of an overview of my sort of current thoughts on the matter. I don't want to be discouraging. I don't want to be discouraging. I think it's an exciting area to look at. But at the end of the day, I guess because I believe in government, at the end of the day, the real test will be the extent to which developing country governments begin to embrace these standards and values and enforce them with their own legal mechanisms, which will then complement these Western pressures. But I think the Western pressures by themselves can't be a substitute for good local government. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
This is a hard or easy question?
For me, it's a hard question. Maybe it's an easy question for you. You've been thinking about this for a long time. So.
Yeah.
Nathan and I, another co-author, are working on a comparative project comparing several kinds of private actor business regulation, international private actor business regulation. And your work focuses on a subset of this,
right,
on civil, what you call civil regulation,
yeah,
right? And this distinction is that it involves some kind of externality, right? Like environment, labor, whatever. And so most of your theorizing is on that,
yeah, exactly,
on civil regulation. And what we're looking at is to see which factors drive the success and legitimacy of these rules, and it might be different because there's a whole bunch of other private regulation, private actor regulation out there, such as, for example, the International Accounting Standards, certified by a private body.
Electrical standards?
Yeah, there's on investment, on credit default swaps, there's a whole bunch out there that are not so much focused at addressing externalities, but you know, enabling business transactions to be more efficient.
Yeah, very important.
So what would your views be, would your views extend to that area of business regulation?
No, I think, and the reason is that those categories of regulation are in the self-interest of the companies. That is to say, they improve the efficiency of markets. These kinds of regulations are a hassle for firms. They make markets more difficult. And that, I think, is the big difference. Okay. So, I mean, if you have plugs, for example, right, or standards regarding, you know, the size of a screwdriver, or, you know, all that. I mean, obviously, that's enormously efficient, right, for companies to have, you know, uniform stuff. And I think the same thing is true with accounting. It lowers the cost of business transactions. They're very important. But I think the politics are very different. And I think the other factor is those kinds of standards that you're talking about are essentially self-governed by firms because they make sense for firms. And they don't involve non-government constituencies. They don't involve labor groups, environmental groups, NGOs on the whole. They're basically private business self-regulation. And that works because they're in the interest of these firms. So it's a very different dynamic. These other regulations are mostly forced on companies by external forces. They may wind up embracing them, but at the end of the day, the pressure and the impetus and the visibility and the scrutiny of them is from non-business constituencies. Well, the average citizen could care less about, you know, plugs. So I think that's a big difference.
Well, one factor that to me seems to be a common issue is the aggregation of dispersed interests.
Yes, that's fair.
Like you said, Walmart is a big company that enforces standards upon suppliers, thereby addressing concerns that diffuse consumers get in trouble. So this is also an issue in, you know, the private actor business regulation. And another thing I would say is that one issue with the kind of private actor business regulation I'm talking about is a legitimacy. We have this issue in the Netherlands with IFRS, for example, with the kind of accounting for pension capital, accumulated pension capital, which was very disadvantageous to certain countries, but not to others. So there are externalities in the kind of regulation.
Yeah, that's fair.
So do you think it's sensible to look at these different field of business, international private actor business regulation from a common lens, or would you say there's...
No, I mean, I would say there are commonalities and differences, and there could be great gradations, right? So the pension one might be more closer to some of these other social ones than the accounting standards, for example, right? There could be a continuum rather than the binary category. So no, I think they're worthwhile comparing. And I think there could be some commonalities, but my general sense is the dynamics are pretty different. Yes, sir.
I really want to find out, we talked about the environmental treaties, and you made mention of some of the countries that actually did not rectify, the US, the China, and all of that. That's actually linked me not to, even if you look at the European countries and you consider many treaties apart from environmental treaties and others that countries sign into, they don't try to domesticate it back home, they don't do it, and then some don't even rectify. So to what extent and what is the impact of all these international treaties?
I mean, there's a huge literature on this, on the impact of these treaties. I would say, you know, basically most of those treaties work to the extent that it's in the self-interest of governments to comply with them. I mean, a lot of times governments sign a treaty that they're already doing it, already meeting those standards, so there's no big deal, or they get subsidies for them. I mean, I think the critical thing is to look at the country, and there are a lot of times when, you know, it's in the country's interest to sign such a treaty, it gets subsidies, it's already doing it. But when it is not in their interest, or when they don't have the administrative capacity to enforce it, then I think it gets very tricky. I think you know, you have massive non-compliance to these treaties in many, many countries. I'm focused on the U.S. and China because they're a necessary condition, but even with their compliance, you could imagine lots of problems. No, I think Global environmental treaties is a big deal. I mean, some of the regional agreements work better. You know, the North Sea agreements, Mediterranean. You know, some of the local border stuff, U.S., Canada. Some of the regional agreements work pretty well. Some of the ones in Europe. Some of the river treaties and stuff like that. When you get globally, it gets a lot trickier. I think some of the regional stuff I think works okay because again, it's in the interest of all the countries. They have a common river, river basin. They have, it's in there. Makes sense for them to sort of cooperate with each other.
Okay. And for the standard which you talk about, I believe that there are actually in developing countries there are actually some standards that are there. But the problem is those who are in charge in enforcing them.
Yeah, enforcement's a big
actually compromise due to some kind of.
But I mean, enforcement's a big problem in the West too. Enforcement's a big problem in the U.S. and Europe. Enforcement's a big problem all over. There are a lot of laws and rules. Enforcement's not confined to other countries. Enforcement's a big problem. Big problem.
So based on your experience, what's actually there? Is there any way out to break that?
Well, I think some countries do a better job if they have enough pressure on by people to improve enforcement. I think it depends on domestic politics. If people care, there'll be pressure. I mean, look at Europe. Look at Europe's policy on GMOs. That's very well enforced. Why? Because massive public support for it. End of story. Well, you don't have to do anything else. Yeah, that's what makes it work. It wasn't, if you look at the European electronic recycling, pretty depressing. Why? Because the average European doesn't think about electronic waste as a serious personal problem for them as a consumer waste. It doesn't engage people, so it doesn't get enforced. People have to care. People care about something that gets enforced. Yes.
You mentioned that the focus on public policy is very important to really take the important step. But governments of developing countries, the priority is economic growth, and what improves competitiveness is when you have lower standards sometimes most of the time.
Yeah.
You're dealing with poor infrastructure.
I don't think that's true.
It is true to an extent.
Well, look at countries. I mean, China has a major involvement.
Let's not take China. Let's take India. Let's take Africa, for example.
Let's take Brazil.
Well, Brazil is also coming up quite a bit.
So where do you want to take? Huh? You going to take South Africa? Think about a really poor country.
Yes.
Give me an example.
Any country in Africa, let's say
Nigeria.
Okay, let's take Nigeria. Okay, let's take Nigeria. Okay, fine. Okay, so here we have Nigeria. Okay, yes?
So yes, and how do you expect public policy to say we have strict environment standards or we adhere to Western standards if they, because it's definitely impossible for them to come to that level for the beginning. You have to invest in a lot of infrastructure.
Well, yes and no.
I'm not saying it's a bad idea, so I'm just saying devil's advocate out here. And I'm saying that, look, I understand what he's saying, but then the ground reality is that it's very difficult to push public policy towards that. And then, yes, we will come up with this public policy, but the implementation is obviously...
Well, look, I don't think, let's take the most pressing environmental problem which every country faces as it develops, clean water. Clean water is like a big deal, right? The lack of clean water and access to clean water is probably responsible for more deaths than anything else in the world, right? Clean water is a big deal, okay? I would think the people in Nigeria would prefer to have clean water, don't you think?
Of course. But...
Even though they're poor, they would prefer to have clean water, right?
Yes.
And access to clean water.
Yes. But that's not the commodity we're talking about. That's the basic need. We're talking here about commodities. We're talking about products.
Well, I think clean water is a pretty important dimension of environmental practice. I think if you had clean water throughout Africa, that would make a big difference in people's lives. So I don't think all these things are just, luxuries. I don't think clean water is a luxury.
I don't think so either. But I'm just trying to see our perspective.
Yeah. Some of the other, I think some of the other areas, as you get richer, you develop a middle class and it cares. Presumably people in Lagos want to breathe the clean air.